July 12, 1944, Normandy, France. In a canvas tent behind the front lines, a small group of American officers sat around a folding table covered with armor penetration charts, ballistic test results, and field reports stained with mud and diesel fuel. These men were not combat soldiers. They were weapons evaluation specialists, ordnance engineers, and technical advisors, men who spoke in numbers rather than battle cries. Their task was simple. Answer one question: can standard American tank and anti-tank weapons defeat the German Panther tank from the front? They already knew the answer. Every crew that had faced a Panther knew the answer, but the Army needed it in writing. Official, documented, undeniable. After reviewing firing trials, examining captured German armor plates, and cross-referencing field reports from armored divisions bleeding across the Bocage, the board delivered its conclusion. No standard American weapon currently deployed in the European theater could reliably penetrate the frontal armor of the German Panther tank at combat ranges. Not the 75mm gun on the M4 Sherman, the backbone of American armored forces. Not the improved 76mm gun rushed to France that same month. Not even the 3-inch gun on the M10 tank destroyer, a vehicle specifically designed to kill enemy tanks. None of them. At any practical range. From the front, this was not rumor spreading through exhausted tank crews at night. This was not the exaggeration of frightened men. This was the official, documented conclusion of the United States Army. A formal admission that the world's greatest industrial power had sent its soldiers to fight the most heavily armored enemy on Earth with weapons that could not do the job. The question that should disturb anyone hearing this for the first time is not how this happened. The question is why. Because the answer existed. It had existed for nearly 2 years. And understanding why it took so long to reach the men who needed it most requires going back to the beginning. To the moment when the United States Army looked at what German tanks had done to France and made a decision that would shape and nearly break American armored warfare for the next 4 years. May 1940, the German Wehrmacht invaded France with a force built around concentrated armor. Panzer divisions, massed on narrow fronts, punched through French defensive lines and drove deep into the rear, cutting supply routes, encircling entire armies, and collapsing that had fought Germany to a bloody stalemate for 4 years in the previous war. France fell in 6 weeks. The shock reverberated through every military establishment in the world, but nowhere more urgently than in Washington. American military planners watched the newsreels and read the intelligence reports with growing alarm. If Germany could destroy France, a country with one of Europe's largest armies, protected by the most elaborate system of permanent fortifications ever built, then what would happen when those same panzer divisions turned toward American forces? The answer, according to one particular American general, was a new kind of unit. Lieutenant General Leslie James McNair, born May 25, 1883 in Verndale, Minnesota, was 61 years old in 1941. A career artilleryman and West Point graduate, class of 1904, McNair commanded Army Ground Forces, the organization responsible for training and equipping every soldier the United States would send to war. He was brilliant, rigid, and absolutely convinced he understood how to defeat German armor. McNair's logic was straightforward. German panzer divisions succeeded by concentrating tanks on a narrow front, overwhelming local anti-tank defenses before reserves could respond. The solution was not to scatter anti-tank guns across the entire front line, where most would never see a tank. The solution was to create specialized mobile units, fast, hard-hitting battalions equipped with self-propelled anti-tank guns that could be held in reserve and rushed to wherever German armor appeared. These units would not fight as tanks. They would not advance against fortified positions or support infantry attacks. Their single purpose was to find enemy tank concentrations, intercept them, and destroy them. Everything about their design followed from this mission. They would sacrifice armor protection for speed. They would carry powerful guns on light, fast chassis. They would use mobility and ambush tactics to negate the advantages of heavier enemy vehicles. McNair gave them a motto that captured everything he believed about their role: seek, strike, and destroy. In September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, the Army tested this concept in the Louisiana maneuvers, the largest peacetime military exercise in American history. Over 400,000 troops participated across the pine forests and swamps of western Louisiana, wargaming scenarios that pitted armored forces against anti-tank defenses. Tank destroyer units performed well. Perhaps too well. The armored force complained that umpire rules favored tank destroyers unfairly. Tanks could only destroy anti-tank guns by physically overrunning them, not by direct fire. Critics argued the results were artificial, that real combat would look nothing like refereed war games in Louisiana pine forests. McNair disagreed. The results validated his theory. On December 3, 1941, 4 days before Pearl Harbor, the War Department formally established the Tank Destroyer Force as a distinct branch of the United States Army. It was a uniquely American experiment. No other nation created a separate military branch dedicated exclusively to hunting tanks. The weapon that would carry this doctrine into battle was the M10 gun motor carriage, soon known as the Wolverine. Built on the proven M4 Sherman chassis, the M10 carried a 3-inch M7 gun in an open-topped turret. The open top saved weight and gave the crew better visibility, critical for a vehicle designed to spot enemy tanks before being spotted itself. The 3-inch gun could penetrate roughly 90 millimeters of armor at 500 yards under ideal conditions. In early 1943, M10s crossed the Atlantic and entered combat in North Africa. At El Guitar, Tunisia, the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, the very first TD unit to see action, caught elements of the 10th Panzer Division advancing down a narrow highway. The terrain was perfect for McNair's doctrine, a dense corridor that channeled German armor into a kill zone, with Kedab Ridge providing the tank destroyers protective cover. The M10s performed well. The 3-inch gun proved effective against the German medium tanks of 1943. The doctrine seemed validated. But buried in the same after-action reports that celebrated El Guitar were quieter warnings. As intelligence from North Africa and the Eastern Front indicated that German armor was evolving rapidly. New tanks were appearing, heavier, thicker, with sloped armor that multiplied effective protection far beyond what raw thickness suggested. The 3-inch gun that worked adequately against Panzer WWIIs and early Panzer IVs was already approaching obsolescence against targets that hadn't yet appeared in large numbers. The man who built the Tank Destroyer Force, who designed its doctrine, who selected its weapons, who trained its men, Leslie McNair, would never see the moment when his creation faced its ultimate test. On July 25, 1944, General Omar Bradley launched Operation Cobra, a massive carpet-bombing assault designed to break the stalemate in Normandy's hedgerow country. Over 1,500 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were tasked with obliterating German defensive positions along a narrow corridor near St. Lo, opening the road for American armor to pour through. The bombing had already gone wrong once. The previous day, July 24th, cloud cover caused confusion, and bombers released their payloads short. Bombs fell on American lines. 25 soldiers were killed, 131 wounded. On July 25th, it happened again. Smoke and dust from the first bomb runs obscured the target markers. Bombardiers in the trailing waves, unable to see the front lines below, released early. Thousands of pounds of high explosives fell among American troops waiting to advance. In a foxhole near the front lines, a 61-year-old lieutenant general, who had come forward to observe the attack that would finally break the deadlock his tank destroyers were supposed to prevent, was killed instantly when a bomb struck his position. Leslie James McNair became the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater during World War II. His body was so badly damaged that identification required his West Point-class ring. The irony was absolute. McNair had spent 3 years building the Tank Destroyer Force. He had fought bureaucratic battles to secure funding, equipment, and institutional support. He had personally championed the doctrine of mobility over firepower, speed over armor. He had selected the 3-inch gun for the M10, believing it would be adequate against any German tank. He died fewer than 3 months before the M36, the weapon that would finally give his tank destroyers the firepower they desperately needed, fired its first shot in combat. He never learned that his doctrine was fundamentally wrong. Tank destroyers were never employed the way he envisioned, held in reserve, massed against panzer spearheads. Field commanders, facing the reality that German armor rarely appeared in the concentrated formations McNair anticipated, used tank destroyers as they saw fit, as mobile fire support, as defensive anchors, as assault guns. Every use violated McNair's doctrine, and yet paradoxically, tank destroyers proved successful in these unauthorized roles. The doctrine failed, the weapons worked. McNair built the right tool for the wrong reason, and died before learning either truth. The weapon that could have saved lives, possibly including McNair's soldiers, had begun its quiet existence nearly 2 years before Cobra's bombs fell on Saint-Lô. In September 1942, 6 months before any American unit encountered a Tiger tank in Tunisia, ordnance engineers at the United States Ordnance Department recognized a convergence that seems obvious in hindsight, but required genuine insight at the time. The American 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun, developed throughout the 1930s to counter high-altitude bombers, possessed extraordinary ballistic performance. Its high muzzle velocity could hurl a 24-pound projectile at speeds exceeding 2,800 feet per second. These same characteristics, optimized to reach aircraft at 40,000 feet, would prove devastating against armored targets at ground level. The 90mm M1 was, in essence, America's answer to the German 88. The famous Flak 18 and its variants had already demonstrated in North Africa and the Eastern Front that an anti-aircraft gun could become a lethal anti-tank weapon. German crews had been doing it since 1940. American engineers proposed the same adaptation, but applying it would prove far more difficult than recognizing the opportunity. The first attempt in August 1942 was catastrophic. Designated T-53, the project mounted a 90mm gun in an open mounting at the rear of an M4 Sherman chassis. The design was rushed, driven by urgency rather than engineering discipline. Testing revealed multiple fatal flaws. The weapon's recoil overwhelmed the Sherman's suspension system. The crew had no meaningful protection. The vehicle's center of gravity shifted dangerously, making accurate firing nearly impossible while stationary and completely impractical while moving. The Tank Destroyer Force, ironically the very organization that most needed a heavier gun, objected strenuously. A contract for 500 vehicles was canceled before a single production model left the factory. The failure of the T-53 taught one essential lesson: you cannot simply bolt a bigger gun onto an existing vehicle and expect it to work. The weapon system had to be designed as a whole: gun, turret, chassis, ammunition stowage, crew ergonomics, or it would fail in ways that killed crews before the enemy could. In October 1942, ordnance engineers tried again. This time, they proposed mounting an experimental 90mm T7 gun, a refined version of the M1 anti-aircraft weapon, into the turret of an M10 tank destroyer. The M10's chassis, derived from the Sherman, offered proven automotive components and adequate weight capacity. But the M10's turret, designed around the lighter 3-inch gun, could not handle the 90mm weapon's weight and recoil forces. A new turret was required, heavier with power traverse, balanced by a massive counterweight bustle at the rear. The concept was sound. The engineering was achievable. The prototype, designated T-71 gun motor carriage, would be completed and ready for testing by September 1943. And here, the story takes a turn that should make anyone who understands what was happening in Normandy in the summer of 1944 deeply uncomfortable. General Andrew Davis Bruce, born in 1894, commanded the Tank Destroyer Force, the very organization that fielded men dying because they lacked adequate anti-tank weapons. Bruce objected to the T-71 project. He favored the lighter M18 Hellcat, a tank destroyer built around speed and mobility rather than heavy firepower. Bruce's reasoning followed McNair's doctrine. Properly employed tank destroyers shouldn't need heavier guns if they maintained tactical flexibility. Bruce was overruled. But his objection was only one friction point in a system full of them. The Ordnance Department worried that 90mm gun production, already stretched to meet anti-aircraft requirements, couldn't support an additional weapon system. Production planners debated which factories could convert M10A1 chassis. Bureaucrats argued over procurement contracts. In November 1943, a full 13 months after the concept was first tested, the T-71 was accepted for limited procurement. Not full production. Limited procurement, a cautious, hedged commitment to a weapon the Army already knew it needed. Production finally began in April 1944. The T-71 was standardized as the 90mm gun motor carriage M36 on June 1, 1944, 5 days before Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. 5 days. 20 months separated the first concept test from official standardization. 20 months during which ordnance engineers knew the 3-inch gun was inadequate. 20 months during which frontline tank destroyer crews fought German armor with weapons that required them to close to suicidal ranges, well within the killing zone of German guns that could destroy their vehicles from a mile away. The first M36s would not reach European ports until September 1944. They would not enter combat until October. Between the first concept test in October 1942 and the first combat engagement in October 1944, 2 full years elapsed. 2 years of bureaucratic friction, production delays, institutional resistance, and doctrinal arguments. While tank crews died fighting vehicles their weapons could not defeat. The M36 was coming, but the men who needed it most had to survive long enough for it to arrive. Many would not. And the summer of 1944, when American armor met the Panther in the hedgerows of Normandy, would prove exactly how many. The M36 had been standardized on June 1st, 5 days before the first American soldier stepped onto Omaha Beach. But standardization on paper and arrival on a battlefield are separated by industrial capacity, shipping logistics, and the unforgiving arithmetic of wartime production. The gun existed. The crews who needed it were dying in Normandy's hedgerows without it. What they faced there was worse than anyone had predicted. The distance between standardization on paper and arrival on a battlefield is measured not in miles but in industrial capacity, logistical planning, and the unforgiving arithmetic of mass production under wartime pressure. The M36 had been standardized as the 90mm gun motor carriage M36 on June 1, 1944, 5 days before D-Day. But standardization meant only that the Army had officially approved the design for production. It did not mean vehicles were rolling off assembly lines. It did not mean crews were being trained. It did not mean ammunition was stockpiled in European depots. Production had begun in April 1944 at Fisher Tank Division's Grand Blanc Arsenal in Michigan. 300 M36s were built there between April and July, assembled by converting M10A1 chassis that had been set aside specifically for this purpose. 300 vehicles in 4 months for an army that needed them yesterday. The demand outstripped supply almost immediately. M10A1 chassis, the preferred foundation because of their superior 4GA V8 engine, were finite. When available hulls ran out, engineers adapted. The M36B1 variant mated the 90mm turret with standard M4A3 Sherman hulls, 187 of them built at Grand Blanc between October and December 1944. The M36B2 used older M10 hulls with twin diesel engines when even Sherman hulls grew scarce. A compromise of a compromise, built because the need was desperate, and perfection was a luxury the war would not permit. American Locomotive Company converted 13 existing M10A1s into M36s between October and December. Massey Harris, a Canadian farm equipment manufacturer, contributed another 500 conversions between June and December 1944. The production network sprawled across factories that months earlier had been building tractors, locomotives, and passenger cars. This was American industrial capacity doing what it did best, not producing the optimal solution, but producing an adequate solution in overwhelming volume, adapting to shortages, substituting components, and never stopping the line. German factories, by contrast, were producing Tigers and Panthers in numbers that seemed impressive on paper, but proved strategically insufficient. The Tiger, the tank that inspired the 90mm anti-tank program in the first place, saw only 1,347 units built across its entire production life. The Panther, Germany's most effective tank, reached approximately 6,000 units total. German engineering was extraordinary. German production capacity was not. The first M36s reached French ports in early September 1944. The 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, commanded by Colonel WWII. Moorhead was the first unit to receive them. The battalion was in transit from Italy, where it had fought with M10s across North Africa, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula since January 1943, one of the most combat-experienced tank destroyer units in the entire army. They drew their M36s during the transfer and moved into the line near Lunéville in eastern France on October 30, 1944, attached to support the French 2nd Armored Division's advance toward Strasbourg. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 3rd Armored Division, received its M36s on September 30th. Crews trained frantically on the new weapon, learning its characteristics through rushed instruction that bore little resemblance to the systematic training doctrines prescribed in field manuals. Loaders discovered that 90mm rounds were substantially heavier and bulkier than the 3-inch ammunition they had handled for months. The loading rhythm they had perfected, the muscle memory that allowed experience to maintain rates of fire under combat stress, had to be relearned from scratch. Gunners adjusted to recoil characteristics markedly different from previous weapons. The M76F telescopic sight, standard on the M36, used reticle patterns unfamiliar to men trained on M10 optics. Elevation and windage adjustments operated differently. Range estimation, the most critical skill a gunner possessed, required recalibration for a weapon with entirely different ballistic properties. Commanders studied ammunition stowage and discovered a sobering limitation. The M36 carried only 47 rounds total. 11 rounds rode in the turret bustle, the counterweight that balanced the long 90mm barrel. 11 more sat in ready racks. The remainder was stored in hull spunsons, accessible only with difficulty during combat. For comparison, a Sherman carried 97 rounds of 75mm ammunition. The M36's heavier firepower came at the cost of endurance. Every round expended was a larger fraction of the total supply, and resupply under fire was dangerous and slow. A few days of rushed training, unfamiliar sights, heavier ammunition, reduced magazine capacity, open-top turrets that offered no protection from above. This was the state of readiness when M36 crews went to war for the first time. The first month of M36 combat revealed a truth that no proving ground test could simulate and no technical manual could prepare crews for. The 90mm M3 gun was devastating. It was also, in certain critical ways, deeply flawed for the close-quarters armored warfare that characterized fighting in Western Europe in the fall of 1944. The muzzle blast was the first problem. When the gun fired, the propellant gases exiting the barrel created a concussive flash and smoke cloud so enormous that it completely obscured the gunner's view through his telescope for several seconds after each shot. In those seconds, 3, 4, sometimes 5, the crew was effectively blind. They could not observe their shot to confirm a hit. They could not adjust aim for a follow-up round. They could not see whether the target was destroyed, damaged, or traversing its turret to return fire. In peacetime testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, this was an inconvenience, noted in clinical language on evaluation forms. In combat, where a Panther or Tiger crew needed less than 10 seconds to identify a threat, traverse their turret, and fire a round that could destroy the M36 from over a mile away, those blind seconds were potentially lethal. The fix was simple. A double baffle muzzle brake that redirected propellant gases sideways rather than forward, reducing both recoil and the blinding flash. But the muzzle brake was not installed on early production M36s. It would not be retrofitted to units in the field until November 1944, a full month after M36s entered combat. For that first month, every crew that fired the 90mm gun in combat experienced the same sequence. The tremendous recoil rocking the entire 29-ton vehicle, the wall of smoke and flame erupting from the muzzle, the agonizing seconds of blindness, while the gunner waited to see whether he had just killed an enemy tank or revealed his position to one. The open-top turret compounded every vulnerability. American tank destroyers, the M10, the M18, and now the M36, all featured turrets without roofs. The design philosophy was deliberate. Open tops reduced weight, lowered the vehicle's silhouette, and gave commanders unobstructed 360-degree observation, critical for spotting threats in the close terrain of European battlefields. The cost was measured in blood. Artillery airbursts, shells fused to detonate above ground level, spraying shrapnel downward, could sweep the interior of an open turret with lethal fragments. Mortar rounds dropping from high angles could land directly inside. Snipers concealed in buildings or tree lines could target exposed crew members. Even tree bursts, artillery rounds detonating in forest canopy, common in the Ardennes, showered wooden splinters and metal fragments into open fighting compartments. M36 crews in the forested terrain of eastern France and the Ardennes fought with this vulnerability every hour of every engagement. There was no technological fix. An optional folding armor roof kit was developed, but it was rare in the field during 1944. Most crews fought without overhead protection for the duration of the war. And then there was the fundamental limitation that the title of this video, and every account of the M36's service, must address honestly. The 90mm M3 gun, for all its power, could not penetrate the frontal armor of the WWII at extended ranges with standard ammunition. This is the fact that separates reality from myth. At the Roer plane battles in November 1944, the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 2nd Armored Division, deployed its M36s against German heavy armor and produced the first large-scale assessment of the 90mm gun in sustained combat. The findings were sobering. The 90mm round would ricochet off the Tiger's 100mm frontal armor plate at ranges between 3,000 and 3,500 yards. To achieve penetration against the front, M36 crews needed to close the distance or target specific weak points: the gun mantlet, the turret ring, the driver's vision port. And German tankers knew this. Tiger commanders, accustomed to operating behind armor, that no previous American weapon could defeat frontally at any range, adapted their tactics to exploit the 90mm gun's limitations. They kept their Tigers at distance, exposing only their heavily armored fronts. They positioned their vehicles hull down behind terrain features, presenting only the turret, the strongest part of the tank, to American gunners. They refused to turn, refused to present their thinner side armor, refused to give M36 crews the favorable angles that would make penetration possible. The 90mm gun was not a magic weapon. It was a conditional weapon. Against Panther turrets at 500 yards, it was effective. The M82 armor-piercing round could penetrate the 100mm turret face and detonate ammunition stored behind the gun breech, often causing catastrophic internal explosions. Against Tiger side armor, it was devastating at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Against King Tiger frontal armor, 150mm sloped, it was useless with standard ammunition at any range. The tungsten-cored 8-VAP rounds could change this equation dramatically, penetrating armor that standard rounds could not. But tungsten was scarce, allocated in tiny quantities that never met them. Most M36 crews fought the entire war without ever loading an HVAP round. What the M36 provided was not invulnerability, not guaranteed kills, not the ability to stand toe-to-toe with a Tiger in a frontal duel. What it provided was a chance to engage German heavy armor at ranges where American crews had some probability of survival, ranges where previous weapons offered no probability of penetration at all. The difference between no chance and some chance is the difference between despair and fighting spirit. Near Freihaldenhoven, in December 1944, an M36 crew from the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion demonstrated both the weapons' capabilities and the tactical skill required to exploit them. A King Tiger appeared at approximately 1,000 yards. a vehicle weighing nearly 75 tons, mounting 150 millimeters of sloped frontal armor and an 88 millimeter WK-43 gun that could destroy any Allied vehicle from ranges exceeding 2 miles. The King Tiger's crew had every reason for confidence. No American weapon had reliably penetrated their frontal armor in combat. The standard engagement drill was to advance frontally, absorb whatever the Americans could throw, and destroy them at leisure with the most powerful tank gun in the world. But the King Tiger was not stationary. It was advancing along a road, navigating around an obstacle, and as it maneuvered, it exposed its side. The turret rotated, presenting its 80 millimeter side armor to the waiting M36. The M36 gunner waited. The geometry was changing with each second as the King Tiger moved. Too early, and the round would strike the heavily armored front at an oblique angle and ricochet. Too late, and the King Tiger would complete its turn, present its front again, and the opportunity would vanish. The gunner fired when the turret side was fully exposed. The 90 millimeter round, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, struck the join between turret and hull on the King Tiger's flank. It penetrated. The explosive filler inside the armor-piercing shell detonated within the fighting compartment. The King Tiger stopped. Smoke poured from its hatches. The crew of the M36 had just destroyed the most heavily armored tank in the world, not through superior technology. Not through overwhelming firepower, through patience, tactical awareness, and the narrow window of vulnerability that even the most formidable weapon system cannot entirely eliminate. This engagement, recorded in the 700 seconds after-action reports, illustrated the reality of M36 combat more accurately than any penetration chart or proving ground test. The M36 did not defeat German heavy armor by outgunning it. It defeated German heavy armor by being good enough, when employed by crews who understood its limitations and waited for the right moment. December 16, 1944. 0530 hours, the Ardennes forest. Darkness so complete that American sentries along an 80-mile front could barely see the tree line 50 yards from their foxholes. 4 American infantry divisions occupied this sector, considered quiet, a place where exhausted units recovered, and Green divisions learned frontline routine before facing serious combat. What those soldiers did not know, what American intelligence had completely failed to detect, was that 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks, including Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers, supported by thousands of artillery pieces, had assembled in the forests opposite their positions over the preceding weeks. At 5:30 in the morning, German artillery erupted simultaneously along the entire front. The barrage was not a prelude to a local attack. It was the opening of Operation Wacht am Rhein, the largest German offensive since the invasion of France in 1940. 3 armies attacking on an 80-mile front, driving west toward the Belgian port of Antwerp, aiming to split the Allied armies in 2 and force a negotiated peace before American industrial might make German defeat inevitable. The offensive depended on speed. German planners knew their forces represented Germany's last strategic reserves. Every tank committed, every gallon of fuel burned, every round fired was irreplaceable. If the attack bogged down, if American reinforcements arrived before German spearheads reached the Meuse River, the offensive would fail, and nothing would remain to stop Allied armies from crossing the Rhine into Germany. The attack also depended on an assumption that was, in December 1944, already becoming dangerously outdated, that German technical superiority in armor would sweep aside American resistance the way it had swept aside the French in 1940, and the Americans at Kasserine Pass in 1943. German armored spearheads pushed west through the Ardennes with confidence born of experience and reinforced by the knowledge that their Panther and Tiger tanks outgunned and outarmored anything the Americans could field. What German planners had not adequately accounted for, what even German intelligence officers who had examined captured M36s and identified the 90mm gun had not fully communicated to frontline commanders, was that this assumption was no longer entirely true. The timing was devastating in its irony. When the German offensive began, by available estimates, approximately 236 M36s were deployed in combat units across the entire Western Front. 236 vehicles to cover an active front stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 2nd Armored Division, reportedly possessed only 18. The 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion operated a mixed force of M10s and M36s, unable to fully equip even a single battalion with the newer weapon. These numbers meant that every M36 in the Ardennes carried responsibility far beyond what any single vehicle was designed to bear. When Panthers appeared, infantry commanders called for M36s. When Tigers were reported, M36s were pulled from other positions and rushed forward. When King Tigers, the nightmare that no other American weapon could address, rolled through the forest roads of eastern Belgium, M36 crews were the only ones called. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion received urgent orders on December 18th to displace north into the path of the German advance. The battalion's M36s, barely 2 months in service, crewed by men still learning the weapon's characteristics, moved through the night on icy roads where drivers struggled to keep 29-ton vehicles from sliding off narrow forest tracks on downhill grades. They reached positions near Verbomont, Belgium on December 20th and immediately went into action alongside the 82nd Airborne Division. The paratroopers of the 82nd, lightly armed and without heavy anti-tank weapons of their own, were attempting to establish a defensive line against German armored spearheads pushing toward the Meuse River crossings. The M36s provided the only heavy anti-tank firepower available to them. Near Saint-Vith, a crossroads town whose defense would prove critical to limiting the depth of German penetration, elements of the 7th Armored Division fought one of the most desperate defensive battles of the entire war. Saint-Vith sat at the junction of multiple roads leading west, roads that German armor needed to maintain the tempo of advance their offensive plan demanded. If Saint-Vith held, German forces would be channeled into narrower corridors, slowing their advance and buying time for American reinforcements to arrive. The terrain around Saint-Vith, rolling hills covered in dense forest, bisected by narrow roads that became icy channels in the December cold, favored defensive fighting but offered limited fields of fire. M36 crews positioned their vehicles to cover the approaches, understanding that German armor pushing west would have to pass through these choke points. The tactical system that emerged at Saint-Vith demonstrated how the M36 fit into American combined arms doctrine, not as a wonder weapon that won battles alone, but as one element in a system that multiplied the effectiveness of every other element. M36s, slower and more heavily armed, occupied static positions covering key approaches. Their 90mm guns provided the long-range killing power necessary to engage German heavy armor at distances where American crews had survivable odds. They sat in hull-down positions behind ridgelines, exposing only their turrets, waiting for German tanks to enter their fields of fire. M18 Hellcats, lighter and faster, operated differently. They used their exceptional speed to conduct flanking attacks, racing to positions where they could hit German tanks from the side, firing 1 or 2 rounds, then displacing before return fire could find them. The M18's 76mm gun could not match the M36's penetration, but against side armor it was sufficient, and the Hellcat's speed, up to 55 miles per hour on roads, gave it survivability that no amount of armor could provide. Infantry screened the flanks, preventing German foot soldiers from infiltrating around tank destroyer positions. Forward artillery observers, positioned where they could see German assembly areas and approach routes, called fire missions on enemy armor at ranges beyond even the M36's engagement distance. When the weather cleared, which it did, intermittently and unpredictably, Allied fighter bombers added another layer of destruction that German logistics, already stretched to the breaking point, could not sustain. No single weapon won the Battle of Saint-Vith. The M36 did not single-handedly stop the German advance. But without the M36's ability to engage Panthers and Tigers at ranges where earlier American weapons had been impotent, the defensive system that held St. Vith for 6 critical days could not have functioned. On December 21st, American tank destroyer forces around St. Vith claimed 30 German tanks destroyed for the loss of 12 American vehicles. The 7th Armored Division's after-action reports credited M36s specifically with destroying 8 Panthers and 2 King Tigers, engagements that would have been functionally impossible with M10s or 76mm Shermans. St. Vith eventually fell on December 21st when the 7th Armored Division, outflanked and nearly surrounded, withdrew westward under orders from higher command. But the 6 days it held cost the German offensive something it could not afford to lose: time. 6 days for American reserves to mobilize. 6 days for armored divisions to move into blocking positions. 6 days for the logistical window, the narrow margin of fuel and ammunition that German planners had calculated with desperate precision, to close. By Christmas Day 1944, the German offensive had penetrated deeply into the Ardennes, but had failed to reach any of its primary objectives. The Meuse River crossings remained in Allied hands. Bastogne, besieged but unbroken, denied German forces the road network they needed for rapid advance westward. And along the shoulders of the Bulge, American defensive positions, anchored in part by M36 tank destroyers, engaging German armor at ranges that had been impossible 3 months earlier, prevented the Germans from widening their penetration. Combined American tank destroyer forces, M10s, M18s, and M36s fighting together in the system their training had prepared them for, destroyed 306 German tanks during the Ardennes campaign. M36-equipped units, despite representing only a fraction of total tank destroyer strength, accounted for a disproportionate share of heavy armor kills. They were the only weapon in the American arsenal that could engage King Tigers with any realistic hope of success, and one of very few that could reliably defeat Panthers from the front. But the M36's most significant contribution to the Battle of the Bulge may not have been tanks it destroyed. It may have been the tanks it deterred. Post-war interrogations of captured German tank crews, documented in intelligence summaries compiled after Germany's surrender, revealed a psychological shift that had begun in late 1944 and accelerated through the Ardennes campaign. German Panther and Tiger commanders, men who had spent months, in some cases years, operating with the confidence that their frontal armor provided effective immunity against American weapons, discovered in the fall and winter of 1944 that this assumption was no longer safe. American 90mm guns could penetrate Panther turrets and mantlets at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Tiger-side armor was vulnerable at distances German crews had considered safe. Even King Tigers, whose frontal armor resisted everything the 90mm gun could throw at it, now had to protect their flanks against a weapon capable of destroying them from ranges that earlier American guns could not have threatened. This knowledge spread through German armored units, not through official intelligence briefings, but through the informal communication that soldiers in every army used to share critical survival information. Tank crews talked to each other. They described engagements where Panthers had been destroyed at ranges where destruction should have been impossible. They identified the distinctive turret shape of the M36, different from the M10 they had learned to recognize, and warned each other that this new vehicle carried a gun that demanded respect. The tactical response was measurable. German tank commanders became more cautious. They advanced more slowly, with greater emphasis on reconnaissance. They were more reluctant to expose their flanks, more careful about their positioning, more willing to withdraw, rather than engage in meeting battles where American firepower advantages could be exploited. Each of these behavioral changes, individually minor, collectively significant, cost the German offensive exactly what it could least afford: speed, momentum, aggression, the willingness to accept risk in pursuit of a breakthrough. Hitler's Ardennes plan required German armor to advance rapidly, overwhelm American resistance through shock and technical superiority, and reach the Meuse before Allied reserves could respond. The plan assumed German tank crews would fight with the same confident aggression had shown in 1940 and 1943. By December 1944, that confidence had been partially eroded. Not destroyed, German tankers remained formidable, skilled, and dangerous opponents until the war's final day. But the psychological edge, the knowledge that their armor made them nearly invulnerable to frontal attack, was gone, and with it went the reckless boldness that breakthrough operations demanded. The M36 did not win the Battle of the Bulge. Tens of thousands of American infantrymen, artillerymen, engineers, airmen, and armored crews of every type won the Battle of the Bulge. But the M36 altered the psychological equation of the battle in ways that German planners had not anticipated and could not counter. A weapon does not need to be perfect to change a war. It needs to be good enough to make the enemy doubt his own advantage. And by December 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the M36 had accomplished exactly that. Before the Ardennes erupted, 15 days before 3 German armies shattered the quiet of an 80-mile front, an engagement on the first day of December had already pushed the M36 to the absolute limit of what its weapon and optics could achieve. December 1, 1944, somewhere along the front in eastern France. The snow had come early that year. By the first day of December, the fields and ridgelines of the Franco-German borderlands lay under a thin white cover that transformed the landscape into something deceptively clean. A world of high contrast where dark shapes moving against white ground stood out with the clarity of ink on paper. Lieutenant Alfred Rose, 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, sat in the commander's position of his M36, scanning the terrain through binoculars. His vehicle occupied a position covering open ground, rolling fields stretching east toward German lines, broken by scattered tree lines and the occasional stone farmhouse. Rose was not looking for a fight at extreme range. No commander plans an engagement at the outer edge of his weapon's capability. He was observing, watching, doing what tank destroyer crews spent most of their time doing, waiting for targets to present themselves, calculating angles, measuring risk. What happened next was not the result of heroism in the cinematic sense. It was not a desperate last stand or a reckless charge. It was the convergence of specific conditions that, taken individually, were unremarkable, but combined, produced one of the most extraordinary single shots in the history of armored warfare. A Panther appeared, moving across open ground at a distance Rose estimated, by eye, using terrain features and his knowledge of the map, at approximately 4,600 yards. 2.5 miles, the maximum graduation on his M76F telescopic sight. At that range, the Panther was a small, dark shape against the snow. Its frontal armor, the 80mm glacis plate sloped at 55 degrees, was effectively impervious to a 90mm round at any distance, let alone 2.5 miles. But the Panther was not facing Rose. It was traversing across his field of view, and it was the vehicle's side. 40mm of armor, thin enough for the 90mm gun to penetrate at ranges far beyond normal engagement distance, that was exposed. The ballistic challenge was extreme. At 4,600 yards, a 90mm round does not travel in a straight line. It arcs. The projectile rises above the line of sight and falls back down in a parabolic trajectory, arriving at the target from a steep angle. The gunner cannot simply place the crosshairs on the target and fire. He must aim high, significantly high, and trust mathematics, training, and the consistency of his ammunition to deliver the round to a point he cannot directly aim at. Rose's gunner adjusted elevation to the maximum graduation on his sight. There was nothing beyond this mark. No higher setting existed. If the target was farther than 4,600 yards, the shot was physically impossible with this optic. He fired. The round traveled for several seconds, an eternity in armored combat, where engagements at normal ranges are measured in fractions of a second between trigger pull and impact. During those seconds, the Panther continued moving, unaware. The round struck the Panther's turret roof, the thinnest armor on the entire vehicle, the one surface where a round arriving from a steep, descending angle could penetrate where a flat trajectory shot never would. The explosive filler inside the armor-piercing shell detonated. Ammunition stored within the turret ignited. The Panther burned. The kill was recorded in the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion's after-action report for December 1944. Multiple witnesses confirmed the engagement. The range, 4,600 yards, was Rose's estimate, not a surveyed measurement. He used terrain features and map references to calculate the distance, a method that was standard practice but inherently imprecise. To put this shot in perspective, it fell only 500 yards short of the longest confirmed tank-on-tank kill in recorded military history. A shot made by a British Challenger 1 tank in the Iraqi desert in 1991, nearly half a century later, using a 120mm rifled gun with fire control systems, laser rangefinders, and thermal imaging that Rose could not have imagined. Rose had iron sights at maximum graduation, a clear day, snow-covered ground providing contrast, and a target moving across open terrain. He had skill. He had favorable conditions, and he had the kind of low-probability fortune that separates an extraordinary shot from an impossible one. This is not a story about superhuman ability. It is a story about what becomes possible when a competent crew operates a capable weapon under ideal conditions at the extreme edge of performance. Shots like this cannot be replicated on demand. They cannot be trained for with any expectation of consistency. They happen when everything aligns, and they are documented because they are exceptional, not because they are representative. Rose's shot was not the only long-range kill recorded by M36 crews during this period. Corporal Anthony Pinto, 1st Platoon, Company A, 610th Tank Destroyer Battalion, destroyed a Panther at 4,200 yards near the village of Gros-Redurching while supporting the 87th Infantry Division. Sergeant Rudy Pohl, who served in Pinto's platoon, recorded the event in the Company A platoon report, writing simply that Tony Pinto did some excellent shooting in knocking out a tank at 4,200 yards. No drama, no embellishment, just a non-commissioned officer noting, in plain language filed at the end of a day that included dozens of other events, that one of his men had made an exceptional shot. The understatement itself tells us something about the men who fought in these vehicles. The extraordinary became, if not routine, then at least a fact to be recorded and moved past. There were other targets, other days. The war was not yet over, but the war was ending, and as it ended, the institution that Leslie McNair had built, the Tank Destroyer Force, began dying with it. In January 1945, the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, Colonel Dwight Moorhead commanding, fought in the German counteroffensive known as Operation Nordwind, the last major German attack in the West, aimed at Allied forces in the Alsace-Lorraine region of eastern France. Near the village of Rimling, the 776 M36s engaged German armor, including, according to battalion records, a Jagdtiger, the massive 71-ton tank destroyer mounting a 128mm gun, the heaviest armored vehicle fielded by any nation during the war. If confirmed, this was the first Jagdtiger destroyed on the Western Front. In March 1945, at Remagen, where American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine intact on March 7th, the M36's most criticized design compromise, its thin armor, became an unexpected strategic advantage. The bridge, damaged by German demolition charges that had failed to bring it down completely, was weakening daily. Heavy vehicles risked collapsing the structure entirely. The M36 weighed 29 tons, a Sherman weighed 33 tons, a Panther weighed 45, a Tiger 57. The M36 could cross the damaged bridge when heavier vehicles could not. M36s from tank destroyer battalions supporting the Remagen bridgehead crossed to the east bank and established defensive positions against German counterattacks attempting to destroy the bridge from the ground. They were credited with knocking out 11 German tanks, including 2 King Tigers, that approached the bridgehead, providing anti-armor protection during the critical hours before Army engineers could construct heavier pontoon bridges capable of supporting Sherman tanks and heavier vehicles. The armor that was too thin to stop a German anti-tank round was light enough to cross a bridge that would have collapsed under a Sherman. The compromise that made the M36 vulnerable in combat made it invaluable in this specific, critical moment. War does not reward perfection. It rewards adequacy in the right place at the right time. By March 1945, American factories had delivered approximately 1,400 M36s of all variants. Production continued even as victory in Europe became inevitable, because the weapon worked and the demand persisted. The M36 had not won the war. No single weapon won the war, but it had filled a gap that, left unfilled, would have cost thousands more American lives. And then, with a speed that startled even those who expected it, the tank destroyer force ceased to exist. After the war, the United States Army conducted extensive reviews of every major weapons program, every doctrinal innovation, every organizational experiment of the conflict. The tank destroyer force received one of the harshest verdicts. Official histories condemned the entire concept, the tank destroyer doctrine. McNair's vision of massed mobile anti-tank battalions intercepting enemy armored spearheads had never been employed as designed. The concentrated German Panzer thrusts it was built to counter had rarely materialized in the form McNair predicted. Field commanders, facing tactical realities that bore little resemblance to the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, had employed tank destroyers in roles their doctrine never anticipated, as assault guns, as mobile fire support, as defensive anchors for infantry positions, as makeshift artillery. General Jacob Devers, who had commanded the 6th Army Group in Europe, wrote bluntly in his assessment, "The tank destroyer concept is not practical on the battlefield. Offensively, the weapon to beat a tank is another tank. The tank destroyer force was dissolved. Its battalions were deactivated. Its institutional knowledge was scattered. The branch that McNair had created in December 1941, that had grown to over 100 battalions by war's end, that had fought from North Africa to the Elbe River, was erased from the Army's organizational structure as though it had been a mistake best forgotten. This verdict has been repeated in military histories for decades. It is on its face defensible. The doctrine was flawed. McNair's theory did not match reality. Tank destroyers were not employed as he intended, but the verdict confuses the failure of a doctrine with the failure of a weapon, and these are not the same thing. The historical record tells a different story when examined closely. Tank destroyer battalions, employed in their unauthorized extra-doctrinal roles, performed effectively across every theater of the war. They destroyed enemy armor. They supported infantry advances. They held defensive positions. They adapted to conditions their training had not prepared them for, and fought successfully in configurations their doctrine had not anticipated. The M36 specifically, the weapon that arrived late, that carried too little armor and too few rounds, that blinded its own crews when it fired, that could not penetrate Tiger frontal armor at long range, proved to be one of the most effective anti-tank weapons the United States fielded during the entire war. It was the only American vehicle-mounted gun that could reliably engage Panthers from the front at combat ranges before the M26 Pershing arrived in tiny numbers in February 1945. It altered the tactical psychology of German armored operations in the war's final 6 months. It provided American crews, for the first time since encountering German heavy armor, with a weapon that gave them a fighting chance rather than a death sentence. The doctrine was wrong, the weapon was right, and the Army, in its post-war reckoning, punished both equally. This remains one of the most significant cases of misattributed failure in American military history. The institutional lesson drawn that specialized tank destroyers were unnecessary because tanks could perform the same role shaped post-war armor development for decades. The M26 Pershing heavy tank rushed into production in 1945, mounted the same 90mm M3 gun as the M36, but in a fully enclosed, heavily armored turret. It was, in many respects, what the M36 would have been if designed as a tank rather than a tank destroyer. The Pershing's lineage led directly to the M46, M47, M48, and eventually the M60, the backbone of American armored forces through the Cold War. Every one of these tanks prioritized what the M36 had demonstrated was essential: a gun powerful enough to defeat enemy heavy armor at maximum range. The M36's tactical lesson, firepower matters as much as protection, survived even as the institution that produced the lesson was destroyed. The M36 itself outlived the force that created it by decades. In the Korean War beginning in June 1950, M36, now primarily the M36B1 variant on M4A3 Sherman hulls, faced Soviet-built T-34-85 tanks operated by North Korean and later Chinese forces. The T-34-85 was a capable vehicle, but it was not a Panther or a Tiger. The 90mm gun that had struggled against German heavy armor found the T-34-85 a far more manageable opponent, penetrating its armor at all practical combat ranges with standard ammunition. The tungsten-cored HVEP rounds that had been critically scarce during World War II were now available in adequate supply, giving M36 crews penetration capabilities they had only dreamed of in the Ardennes. The psychological effect on North Korean and Chinese tank crews mirrored what German crews had experienced 5 years earlier. Armored operations became more cautious, more defensive, more reluctant to accept risk. The M36, designed to fight the most advanced tanks in the world, found itself overpowering an opponent it had not been designed for, and doing so with the quiet effectiveness of a that had already proven itself under far more demanding conditions. But the M36's most remarkable chapter was yet to come, in a place and time no one who designed, built, or first fought in the vehicle could have imagined. Yugoslavia purchased approximately 400 M36s after the war. Yugoslav engineers, maintaining the vehicles across decades of Cold War service, eventually replaced the original Ford GA V8 gasoline engines with 500 horsepower diesel engines taken from Soviet-made T-55 tanks. The conversion extended the vehicle's operational life far beyond anything its designers anticipated. In the early 1990s, nearly 50 years after the first M36 rolled off the assembly line at Grand Blanc Arsenal, these Yugoslav M36s went to war again. They fought in the Croatian War of Independence. They saw action in the conflicts that tore Yugoslavia apart. Vehicles designed in 1942, built in 1944, re-engined with Soviet power plants, fired their 90mm guns in anger in a post-Cold War world that would have been unrecognizable to the men who first crewed them in the forests of eastern France. Few World War II combat vehicles remained in frontline military service in the 1990s. The M36's longevity, partly a reflection of Yugoslavia's limited defense budget, partly a testament to the fundamental soundness of the design, stands as perhaps the most concrete validation of the engineering compromises that defined the vehicle from its inception. The M36 was never given an official nickname during the war. The name Jackson, a reference to Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, appears in some wartime documents but was not widely used by the soldiers who fought in it. They called it the M36, or the 90mm gun motor carriage, or simply the TD. It had thin armor whose sides could not stop heavy machine gun fire from close range. It had an open turret that never received a permanent fix. It carried fewer rounds than the tank it was derived from. Its muzzle blast blinded its own gunners for critical seconds after every shot. It could not penetrate the frontal armor of the Tiger at extended range with standard ammunition, and it could not penetrate the frontal armor of the King Tiger at any range with any standard round available. It was not the best anti-tank weapon of the war. The British 17-pounder fired a faster round. The German 88mm K-43 was more accurate. The Soviet 122mm gun on the IS-2 delivered more destructive energy per shot. What the M36 was, what made it matter, was adequate. Adequate firepower against the most common German heavy tanks at ranges where American crews could survive the engagement. Adequate production numbers to equip battalions across the Western Front. Adequate reliability to fight through a winter campaign in the Ardennes without catastrophic mechanical failure. Adequate adaptability to serve on different chassis when preferred hulls ran out. It was the right weapon at the right time in sufficient numbers to change the tactical equation of the war's final months. Not perfect, not revolutionary, just good enough. And in war, where the perfect is perpetually the enemy of the available, good enough, delivered on time in sufficient quantity, has won more battles than masterpieces that arrived too late or in numbers too small to matter. Germany built approximately 1,347 Tiger IS, magnificent machines, each one a masterwork of armor engineering. Together, they were not enough. The United States built approximately 2,304 M36s in barely a year, imperfect machines. Each one a compromise. Together, they were exactly enough. The M36 proved that warfare outcomes depend not solely on individual weapon superiority, but on industrial capacity, tactical doctrine, operational flexibility, and the institutional ability to identify a problem and field an adequate solution before the problem becomes a catastrophe. This is its legacy, not the legend of invincibility, not the myth of the wonder weapon, but the harder, less dramatic truth that the men who fought in M36s understood in their bones, even if the army that sent them to war refused to acknowledge it afterward. Sometimes good enough is everything. One question remains: Lieutenant Alfred Rose's 4,600-yard shot, recorded in the after-action report of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, confirmed by multiple witnesses, analyzed by researchers who have studied the terrain, the weapon's ballistics, and the capabilities of the M36F telescopic sight at its maximum graduation. The shot is plausible. The 90mm M3 gun had the ballistic range. The Panther's thin turret roof was vulnerable to a round arriving at a steep descending angle. The snow-covered terrain provided the contrast necessary to identify a target at extreme distance. The conditions, clear weather, open ground, a target moving laterally, were favorable. It is also at 4,600 yards, only 500 yards short of the longest confirmed tank kill in history, achieved nearly 50 years later by a Challenger 1 using technology that would have seemed like science fiction to a crew in 1944. Did it happen exactly as the after-action report describes? The range was estimated by eye and map, not measured by instruments. After-action reports, written in the exhaustion and confusion of active combat, are primary sources, but they are not infallible. They reflect what men believed happened, filtered through adrenaline, distance, and the imperfect observations of a battlefield where smoke, terrain, and chaos obscure certainty. The evidence supports the shot. The evidence does not prove the shot beyond all doubt. This is not a failure of the historical record. This is what the historical record looks like for nearly every remarkable event in the chaos of war: credible, documented, witnessed, but existing in the space between certainty and legend. Whether Rose's shot landed at exactly 4,600 yards, or 4,000 or 3,500, the fundamental truth it represents remains unchanged. In December 1944, American tank destroyer crews, operating a weapon that was imperfect, inadequately armored, and 6 months late to the battlefield, were engaging and destroying German heavy armor at ranges that would have been inconceivable with any weapon available to them the previous summer. That is not a legend, that is a fact, and it is the fact that matters. Thank you for watching.